Good morning. In today's class, I want to talk about finding scholarly resources and also research skills. But before I start, I want to remind you of the importance of focusing on the assignment task. So before you start your researching, I encourage you to take some time to study the assessment task carefully and to consider what is expected. Read through it and then write down what you are expected to do and go back to the handbook and the question often as you do your research to remind yourself of what you're being asked to do. This will save you a lot of time later on. It'll help you to better target your research. It'll also help to make sure that you produce the most relevant work, most focused on the topic that's been set, most focused on the material that you have been provided with, what you've been asked to do. So remember, read the assignment question regularly during your researching process to ensure that you're keeping on track and that you're looking at the areas you've been asked to look at. Look up the details of the subject and the assignment task in the subject guide and look at the way you're going to be marked and assessed on this subject. And ask yourself some critical questions about the research that you're going to do. For instance, what are you being asked to do and how are you being asked to go about it? What's meant by the terms that are used? Are you being asked to describe or compare or evaluate or discuss the certain areas you're asked to look at? And what's meant by the various words that are used to describe these tasks and ideas that you're being asked to look at? Should you focus on text, primary text themselves, or should you focus on information that you've been given? Are you expected to go much further? How many references and resources are you expected to use? And what are the word limits? What's the due date? What are the format restrictions that you're expected to give? Some students spend too long on some tasks that have less marks and less words and don't spend enough time on the tasks that are going to have the most words needed and the higher grade given to them. How will it be graded? What assessment task will have a marking rubric or guide, and you can look up this marking rubric and guide and look at how you're going to be assessed. This guide or rubric will tell you how much of the assignment's total grade is going to be allocated for different aspects of the task, and using the rubric as a guide on how much time you can spend or dedicate to each portion of the assessment task can be very helpful. Your assignment rubric, for example, might say that 30% of the marks are going to be given for evidence or supporting claims, but 10% for accurate, consistent referencing. So even though you need to spend time on the referencing, that shouldn't take up all of your time. You need to spend time gathering the information and looking for evidence. It's also good to use the reading list and textbook as a starting point for your research. This is going to keep you on track. It'll guide you as to the most current and focused information that you're going to be looking at. The recommended reading list and textbook are often the handy place to start searching for the resources. And at the end of each lesson or at the end of each chapter in your textbook, you'll often find that there are other relevant high quality scholarly resources that are referred to, and this will keep you on track looking at the scholarly resources that are relevant to the subject that you are looking at. Remember, the referenced authors and references to their writing at the end of each chapter or at the end of each lesson will give you areas to start searching further, but you need to keep focused on the topic area that you are looking at and not to explore other areas of interest too much. You can leave that for another day. Your recommended reading list and textbook often offer key ideas about your topic, key words, specialist language, subject-specific words for your topic, and you can use these to do further research on Google Scholar or in the library catalogue to find out other scholarly resources that you can be looking at. These key terms will often help you to locate other resources as well. Let's look now at finding some resources for your assignments. Once you know what you're looking at, how much time you're going to spend on each part of your assignment, you might draw up a rough draft or outline of what you're going to work on. One of the most important deciders of how much good material you find is going to be your search strategies. And these search strategies will depend on the type of resource you're looking for and the type of knowledge that you're after. So the process of finding the resources will often introduce you to new terms and concepts that you may fully know all the details about as you start to explore them. But don't worry too much about your lack of knowledge at this stage. Remember, this will grow as you continue to do your research. Write it down, look up the meaning of the terms, go over the meaning of these terms a number of times, and develop a richer understanding of these terms. But don't be held back by not fully knowing all the details as you start. That's to be expected. In terms of finding relevant and valuable resources, this is central to the essay writing task, and it's going to be time consuming. Thus, sufficient time needs to be set aside for locating, reading, note-taking, editing, and reworking of the information that you gather from these resources. The potential sources, of course, are wide and varied. There's popular books, there's websites, there's television programs, radio, video clips, and many, many sources that you could potentially draw upon. There's sermons, there's talks that have been given. But in tertiary study, we usually focus on two main sources. These are scholarly books that are relevant to your subject and scholarly journal articles that are written by experts in the field. And that's because the scholarly approach is quite different to popular writing, where people are just wanting to briefly communicate their ideas in the popular writing and to gather sales. In scholarly writing, they're seeking a deeper scholarly engagement with the material through engaging with a large number of scholars. In tertiary study, because we focus on just a few sources, scholarly books and scholarly journal articles written by experts in the field or discipline, you should ask some questions before you choose a resource. What is a scholarly book or journal? And we'll discuss this more fully in a few moments. And is the resource you're thinking of looking at scholarly, and why or why not? Did contemporary experts or researchers or scholars in the field write the resource? And you can check the list of researchers listed in the subject handbook for your subject to find out whether they're listed there. Scholarly resources have in-text citations and the reference list to show the sources of their information, often a large list, and often every paragraph has references. This often includes a sizable number of scholars. So you need to ask firstly, does your resource have a large number of scholarly citations in the paragraphs and a large number of references at the end of the resource? And you can look up further resources or references using Google Scholar or the college catalogue once you find some of these cited scholars in each paragraph. That'll give you a lot more areas to explore, but again, you need to keep focused. Is the article peer reviewed? Most scholarly articles and books are peer reviewed. That is, there is a statement that they've been reviewed by other scholars in the area. And this will mean that other experts in the field have evaluated the resource before it's published. Many, many websites, of course, don't have that. They don't have a large number of references, and they're not peer reviewed, and they're not published by scholarly publishers. The review by peers before publication shows that they've met high, rigorous standards set by scholars and their institutions. Another question you could ask is, are the resources written in a formal academic writing style, using specialised discipline terminology? Or are they written in a less popular, less academic, more popular manner? One of the fastest ways to find out if a book or article is scholarly is to check the name of the publisher. Is it published by University Press, Oxford, Cambridge, Chicago, Harvard? Is it published by an academic press, Blackwell, Routledge, Palgrave, Ashgate, and many more? Consider, who is the publisher? Is the publisher known for publishing scholarly resources? Also, consider the intended audience. Is it written for other scholars using scholarly words, long sentences, paragraphs with many references? Or is it written for a more popular audience? Scholarly books are published to contribute to research and to knowledge and to support future research, and they're not necessarily written for making money. And a scholarly book reports on original research, experimentation, as experts write them, as they interact with the writings of other experts. And they also use specialised jargon. They're harder to read. They often have a clear statement of the name of the author and the name of a well-recognised publisher or well-recognised journal, and also the name of the many, many scholars that they've interacted with. Does your resource have this? They include references in most paragraphs and a reference list at the end of the article or each chapter of the book. And they provide current in-depth information, and this is supported by evidence and other studies. Primarily, they're words and text, and there's few photographs and few headings because they're focusing on information, speaking to other scholars who are focused on information. And the sentences, paragraphs, and other sections are often quite long when compared to popular writing. So instead of short sentences and short paragraphs in popular writing and a short length of the overall article that captures interest and holds interest in popular writing, they're long because they're expecting that the scholars reading them are able to engage with longer, more complex sentences, paragraphs, and an overall article. You also need to think a bit about how much to read. You can't read all of every book or every paragraph in every article that you read. So you need to quickly skim the introduction, skim the contents page, and look for just a few pages that are going to have the most exact amount of information that you're looking for. It's easy to underestimate or overestimate the amount of resources or reading that is needed. And so usually we would expect 8 to 12 to 15 or so scholarly resources in many of the essays and assignments that you do. And often you want 5 to 8 scholarly resources per 1,000 words. And if you include more scholarly resources, often you'll do better, but there's a limit. And often you get a feel after a few scholarly resources that you have covered the ground quite well. For each major point you make, if you only interact with one scholarly resource, that'll more likely be a summary of what they have said. But if you interact with 2 or 3 or more scholarly resources for each major idea you're looking at, that'll show that you are comparing different views and different aspects of the area that you're looking at. So each paragraph or few paragraphs should interact with a number of different scholarly resources, showing that you are looking at a wide variety of viewpoints. And then you can draw your own ideas and conclusions from the information that you gather. You'll often find that there are more resources in reading than you could possibly go through. So your skill is going to be locating the resources, finding the small number of key ideas and thoughts that you're wanting to look at, and summarizing them in a quick amount of time. And this is a skill that develops over time as you practice. Often you'll begin by looking at the main general ideas, and then you'll begin to focus more and more to examine a small number of key ideas in greater depth. And often you want one overall major argument that you're presenting in your assignment, and then you're wanting a number of subpoints, but you don't want to try and cover everything or cover too much. You won't have room for that. Journals are usually published in volumes and issues, monthly, quarterly, annually, and you see the names of scholars. So think about who's the author of the journal, why is it published, what sort of material is it looking at. Scholarly journals often have a theme or a speciality, and so once you find a particular journal, you can look further at it. So Australian Political Science Journal would focus on politics, and the Theology Journal on theology, Education Journal on education, and so on. So you need to know how to find these relevant journal articles, and you'll find that there are resources that are written on academic research that you can find in the library, and if you talk to the librarian and other lecturers, that they'll give you guidance there as well. Keep in mind, not all the resources, even though they're scholarly resources, are going to be equal. Some will be stronger than others. Some will be written by stronger scholars. Some people use the acronym PROMPT to remind them of some of the ways in which they can keep focused in their search for relevant resources. Presentation, how's the material presented? What's its relevance? How relevant is the material to what you're looking at? How objective is it? Is it carefully looking at the evidence, or is it trying to push a particular viewpoint? What method do they use? What provenance? How long is it lasting through time? And how timely is it in the presentation? I encourage you, in terms of finding scholarly resources, to use Google Scholar, scholar.google.com.au. It's freely accessible as a web search engine, and it automatically goes to scholarly resources there. So Google Scholar uses a keyword search to find scholarly resources. I also encourage you to use the college library resources, the online library resources, and the online journals to do further search for your topic and for scholars who have written in your area. I then encourage you to scan the resource and to consider where the most relevant information is located and to turn to that area. I encourage you to be objective, that is, to scrutinize whether the source is authentic and credible, written by scholars using sound evidence and methods, and to think about whether the author is stating a fact or an expression of opinion, or whether they've got a vested interest that they're trying to push and they're using emotive language. I encourage you to consider the methods and disciplines that have been used to study in the writing of the book or article. What kind of method was the scholar using? Were they studying particular text written at a particular time? Is it scientific research? What's their experimental design? What's their sample size? How was the data collected and analysed? Good resources often come from other authoritative sources, and therefore it's important to determine who wrote the resource, what's their background. Is the source attributed properly? Are they experts in the field, and are they belonging to particular organisations or universities or educational organisations, government organisations that are guiding the way they do their work? Has the source undergone peer review? And also be aware of whether it reflects current timely thinking in the field of study. When was it published? Is there other information corroborated by other sources? So all the hard work put into researching only matters if the material you find is relevant and effective. So you need to show that you've put in the work, that you have distinguished the ideas that you gather and your ideas from the various authors that you have gathered. And so I encourage you to put time into thinking about these ideas, comparing the different ideas and expressing your own ideas in your own words to find your own voice. This is good training. Communication is always contextual. You need to think about the context of the material that you read, and also think about the context of who you're writing to and who are the people around you. And then you need to move to the note-taking part of the gathering of the information, where you need to carefully take the notes in an organised way and think about why you're taking the various notes and how you're going to work through them. That'll be the topic for another time, as to how to put those notes together. In this class today, we've mainly talked about locating and researching scholarly resources, and how to develop research skills so that you find the most relevant resources by the strongest scholars, rather than just drawing on any resource that you find, or popular resources. We've mentioned also the use of Google Scholar and the use of the college resources, and we've mentioned also ways of evaluating these resources to determine if they are scholarly resources. We've talked about the importance of peer-reviewed resources, the importance of resources with references, the importance of resources where you know the name of the scholar. Sometimes I find that people will hand in assignments and they'll quote Wikipedia. And one of the difficulties there is that we don't know who the author is. We often don't know many of the references that have been used, although Wikipedia is using more references now. We often don't know how recently it was written, and it's not written through a scholarly publisher. Often we don't know who is writing the various items. So usually we wouldn't use that at all in our scholarly writing. Instead, we turn to scholarly books, scholarly journal articles, such as those described in this assignment. So I encourage you, in moving forward, there will be times when you feel a bit uncertain about which are the best resources. But if you go back to your handbook, and if you go back to your textbook, and if you check over the sort of material that you've been asked to look at, and look over the tasks that you've been asked to focus on, then I'm sure you'll grow in confidence as you work through the material, and you'll do well in your studies. Thank you.